All right, I am going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to St. Louis Public Library and Three Rivers Beekeepers. Educator Jill here for our program, All Things Honeybee. My name is Erica. I'm the Adult Services Provider here at Central Library in the Science and Technology Room. And it is my pleasure to have Jill here with us today. A couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to Jill. The program is being recorded, so if you miss anything or you have to run away for a minute, have no fears. It will be posted to the library's website. If you have any questions, use the chat box, please, and just hang on to them until the end of the program. Jill is very excited to take any, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And I think that's about all I have. Take it away, Jill.
Okay, let's see if we can do this if I can get the slideshow up. So far, so good, maybe.
Yep.
Okay, I must be getting better finally. Finally figured it out after a year. So hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Jill James. I am a beekeeper. I've been doing it. This is my 6th year. I've got 3 hives at home in my backyard right now, and I have 1 hive offsite at a garden. So far, so good. They seem to have made it through the winter, so that's pretty exciting. The crazy weather we get, you never know what you're doing. And I'm also a member of Three Rivers Beekeepers, and we meet out in St. Peters, Missouri at the University of Missouri Extension off of Brown Road. So today I want to introduce you to the honeybee and a little bit about beekeeping, what we do. The honeybee is pretty interesting, and they're also very important. They go from blossom to blossom. They collect nectar and pollen and take that back to their hive because that's their food. So they're not really eating while they're out. They take it back and they store it and then they eat. But while they're bopping around from flower to flower and getting all this nectar and pollen, something else pretty cool is going on. And it's called pollination. And I know everybody's heard a lot about it. It's just the transfer of pollen from one blossom to another. And that's a pretty big deal because 1/3 of the food that we eat comes from plants that need to be pollinated in order to generate the fruit, nut, or vegetable that that plant produces. And it's not really just our food. If you kind of look down in the lower right corner by the bottle of oil, but to the left, there's a big roll of hay. Other crops like clover and alfalfa also need to be pollinated in order to grow. And that's important because those are crops for livestock. So it's not only our food, but think of a dairy cow that she has to eat the clover. And if we didn't have her, we wouldn't get milk, which we couldn't get cheese or, heaven forbid, ice cream. That would put me off the map right there. And then if you look below the hay, you'll see that fluffy white ball. Well, we don't eat it, but that's cotton. And we do use the fibers so that we can make clothing and bandages. And it's also kind of incorporated in paper and paper products. So even though we're not eating it, we still rely on that plant for something that we use almost pretty much every day. And we kind of forget about trees, except that they do give us fruit. So as a food source, that's good. But what about the shade that we get? Think how hot Earth would be if we didn't have any shade from all the trees. And maple trees are a really good early food source for bees. Right now, mine have budded and they're just starting to open up, believe it or not. They've been open probably about a week or 2. And bees are pulling pollen out of those little buds already, which is really good because they can get started and getting early food, fresh food in and start raising some new bees for this year. And then trees also filter our air. They get the pollution out of it. So we've got clean air to breathe. And then we harvest certain varieties that we use for lumber in our buildings. So there's a lot that goes on with pollination that we kind of really don't think about. And when you sit back, it's all connected and it all trickles down. So thank you, the bees, for pollinating some of this stuff. And I know that honeybees get a lot of attention, and yes, there are other pollinators as well. But the honeybee, we scientists have determined, are responsible for 2/3 of the pollination that happens. But we also have these native bees. There's several species of them, but most common that we know are bumblebees and mason bees. And we've also got moths and wasps and animals like bats that are pollinators. And they're all kind of specialty pollinators because some things are too big for a honeybee, like the squash blossom or a tomato blossom. A honeybee doesn't even register that it's in that blossom, and that flower doesn't release any pollen. So it takes that bumblebee to get into that squash or tomato blossom, to get in there and buzz around and make a fuss to get that pollen released. So she specializes in a lot of things like that because the honeybee is too small. And then there's a few varieties of blueberries and certain orchard flowers. They're actually too small for the honeybee. She's too big to get down in there and get any nectar or pollen. And that's where a lot of the mason bees come in as their specialists, because they're a lot smaller, so they can get down in there and they take care of those varieties for us, which is good, because if the honeybee can't do it, then we can't do it. And there's other things that bloom at night, like there's certain cactuses or cacti, I guess they are, that bloom at night, and honeybees aren't out at night. So moths and bats are really good pollinators for things that blossom and open up at night. So what makes honeybees such good pollinators? One of the things is because there's a lot of them. This is one colony, and within a colony of honeybees, you can have average of 60,000 bees. So if you compare that to a bumblebee nest, the bumblebee has maybe 100 to 200 bees in her nest. So honeybees have a lot of numbers to get the job done. And they also cover a pretty big area. A honeybee will forage about 2 miles from their hive to find food. They will go 3 or 4 miles if they have to, if for some reason there isn't a lot or things are drying out. It's not as efficient because the farther they have to fly, the more energy they burn. But their average range is about 2 miles from the hive. So if we compare that again to the bumblebee, a bumblebee will forage about 1/3 of a mile from its nest. So that's not a lot of ground, and bumblebees aren't very good flyers. We've all heard all the poor jokes about it. So they're not very good flyers. They stay fairly close. So honeybees get out there, they've got numbers, they cover a lot of area. But what goes on inside of a hive? And they're pretty interesting once you really start getting into things. It's just amazing that they function the way they do and accomplish what they do. So within a colony, there are 3 ranks of bees. So everyone knows about the queen. We all know that. There's only one queen in a colony, and she only has one job, and that's to lay eggs. She does nothing else but walk around through the hive and lay eggs. She can lay 1,500 to 2,000 eggs per day. And she usually lives 2 to 4 years. She stays at home. She doesn't leave the hive when she's there. She really doesn't have any threats. So she'll live pretty long, 2 to 4 years. The other 2 ranks are drones, which are the male bees. And you'll find maybe 100 to 200 drones in a colony. We don't need a lot of them, but we need some, because their job is to go out, they fly out from the hive and they find unrelated queens to start new colonies. So we don't need a lot of them, but they need some because that's what keeps the species going by starting new colonies. And then the last group that we're probably pretty familiar with are called worker bees. So we started off with 60,000 bees. We've got one queen and 200 drones. So the other 59,799 bees that are in that colony are all workers. And they're kind of the stars of the hive. They do everything else. They are female bees, but they don't lay eggs because they know that's the queen's job. But they do everything else in that hive, from cleaning to babysitting and feeding the young bees and larvae at 12 to 17. This is all by how old they are, by days, because a worker bee only lives about 4 to 6 weeks. Drones live from spring to fall. Worker bees have the shortest lifespan of all of them. And that's why there's so many, because there has to be a lot of work done because they have a lot of responsibilities. So there's a really big turnover because they don't live very long and they work very hard. So my favorite is that 12 to 17 day range because they can make wax at that age. And they're the ones that build the comb. And then they move up and they're guard and ventilator bees. They actually do guard the entrance. They make sure no other bees wander in if they don't live there, because they might come in and try to steal their food. And moths will come in, wasps try to come in, steal the food. Mice come in, and believe it or not, bees will line up and fight off mice in the fall if they're trying to move into their nice warm hive and take over. And then the last couple weeks, like the last 14 days or so, is when they fly. That's when they actually have, for the first time, are leaving the hive. Up until then, they haven't been outside. They haven't flown because there's no room in the hive. It's pretty crowded. They just crawl around. So those last 14 days, they start a couple days ahead, and they're building up their wing muscles and getting going. But that's the last job that they do as that worker bee, is a forager. And they're the ones who go out and gather the nectar and pollen. Those are the bees you see in your yard on your flowers. You don't see the nurse bees, you don't see any wax builders. It's only that last age group of foragers that you'll see in your backyard. So kind of think about it when you see them this summer and think, gosh, this little bee, she's doing the last thing she'll ever do. And I don't know, give her a pat on the wing or something, because that's pretty special. And if you think about this, remember they go 2 miles from the hive. So I'm going to do a little bit of math, but I have a cheat sheet, so don't worry. 2 miles out, 2 miles back, that's 4 miles she flew for one trip to get nectar or pollen. She'll probably make anywhere from 8 to 14 or 16 trips, but I'm going to use 10 because 10 is really easy to multiply with. So let's go 4 miles, 10 trips, 40 miles. But she's doing this for 2 weeks. So times 14 days, that comes up to like 560 miles. I mean, I force myself to walk a couple of miles a few times a week. I can't even imagine, for the size of a honeybee, for half an inch, she flies almost 600, probably over 600 miles in 2 weeks for the last thing that she does. And that's why when they get to that stage, they literally wear out. They work themselves to death because flying is really hard. They have to go up against the weather. You don't know if it's going to be windy, which takes extra effort. They might get caught in a rainstorm. And they're always dodging birds because birds eat bees. So just kind of think, when you see her out there, think of what she goes through just to do that, to get out there and collect that food and take it back to support her colony. Because that's all she's doing it for, is to support the colony so they can survive. So I told you I like the wax makers, so of course I have to give them a little bit of a highlight because they're just really cool. And I never thought I would look in a hive and be able to see a bee with my very own eyes making wax. And it's a real thing. I saw one and I was so excited because I thought, don't you need a microscope or something? Because this is little tiny stuff. But you can actually look in there and see them. And so it's pretty interesting because it takes a lot of energy for these bees to make wax. They have to eat a lot, but they don't make very much. Those 8 little flakes that you see on the one up in the upper corner, that's a day's work. That's all she gets for one day. And when you think about how much wax they have to build in a hive, that just doesn't go very far. But they get it done. You can see in that empty frame, they're building, they're making wax, they're getting it full, but it takes them a while. So they have to be really careful and figure out the best way to use wax. And we've always been fascinated, why is it a hexagon? Why isn't it a circle? Why not a square? And scientists have done studies and analyzed and looked at things and realized that bees are really smart because the hexagon gives them the smallest amount of space they need without wasting space and without wasting time and materials building something that they don't need. It fits perfectly for the size of the larva as it grows, and it's perfect for storing the honey or the nectar that they turn into honey and the pollen. So the hexagon's not an accident. The bees know this and they make it. It's all the exact same size. It never varies. And it's very strong because it has 6 sides in common. It also goes faster because when you kind of have one cell built, you already have a side for the others. And as you get more built and connected, you have less sides to build. So it also goes faster and it takes less material since they only produce those 8 little flakes just about once a day. So bees are kind of, they're like little engineers. They figured all that out and do all this stuff on their own. And then there are 9 species of bees, only 9 now in the whole, world or US, I guess. Only 9 species that make some form of honey. But the honeybee is the only one that actually makes honey to store for future use. Honeybees do not hibernate. Now, obviously, when it's December and January and there's snow on the ground, they don't fly. But they're inside their hive and they are balling up together and bunching up and generating heat to stay warm. And that takes a lot of energy. So they have to have some food because they do not go into a hibernation mode like other bees or other animals. So the trick with nectar is it's water. It's 80% water, just like drinking Kool-Aid. So the bees have to fan it down and dry it out. And they have to get it to a specific moisture content before they can seal it. They put a wax cap over it to seal it. And it's a solid cap, so it keeps moisture from the environment out. Because if they get it down to that percentage, that 16 to 18%, and leave it open, it's going to pull in some moisture from just the air outside. Which is why when you've got honey at home, you always want to keep the jar sealed really tight because you don't want the moisture from your house to get into that. If it gets more than 18%, it'll spoil. It ferments and spoils, and then it's no good. You can't eat it, and it tastes terrible anyway. If they dry it out below the 16%, it's too dry and it's very sticky. They can't eat it. So they have to be really sure, and however they measure or taste and determine, they always get it right, but they will cap that honey so that they have it for winter. But if they don't get it right, if they open it up and it's too wet and it's spoiled, they're going to starve. And the same thing if it's too dry. If they can't eat it because it's too sticky and too dry, they're going to starve. Even if they could get out, if this was not snow, but a 60-degree day in January, which we have, there's nothing blooming. There is nothing out there they can go and get a drop of nectar from or a speck of pollen. So they need to store up for winter. And if you think how far ahead they have to plan this, because our nectar flows are usually May and June, a little bit into July, but by July it's getting hot and dry, flowers are kind of drying up, and there's not a lot out there. So they're thinking in May, they're collecting all this nectar that they can so they can get it processed down and sealed off for November, December, and January, and probably into February. So they're really good at planning on this stuff. And the more I get into with beekeeping and the more I learn, and I keep finding out new stuff all the time, it's just, wow, bees are pretty amazing. And that's what got me into beekeeping. It's not that I was crazy. I didn't have a death wish or, was trying to prove how brave I was, looking into a whole hive of bees. But I just found them so darn interesting. I kept wanting to learn more and I wanted to see more. And next thing I knew, I was a beekeeper. But when I told everybody, I got the side eye look of, yeah, really? Why? Why would you want to do this? And it's just because they're interesting. And the word beekeeper or beekeeper is kind of misleading because bees are wild. They're not pets. We really don't keep them. But what we hope to do is manage them. And it's usually to our benefit. We want honey, or we're going to do pollen, or some other things. Maybe we want better gardens. But we really manage them more than that. And to say you're a beekeeper, you're also a little bit of a scientist and a meteorologist, a botanist, and a detective and a gardener, because you can't do beekeeping without the other stuff. It's like pollination. It all connects and goes together. When you're a beekeeper, all of a sudden you're watching the weather. Is it going to be cold? Is it going to rain? Are we going to have snow? Can I get in the hive? Is it windy? It makes you crazy. But then you have to be a detective. You have to kind of know what's going on, see if there are any problems. Then you turn into a gardener because you want to plant things now that your bees are going to eat. So you want to make sure you're planting really good food for them and not just some junk food or something pretty that they're going to ignore. So it's a little misleading when we say keeping, but we pretend to think we influence it. So bees have been around for a long time. They don't necessarily, they need us, but they don't need us. They've survived longer than we've been beekeepers. But we seem to think they need our help, and now we're going in because we have influenced their environment. So that does kind of make us responsible for giving them a little bit of help where we can. So as a beekeeper, what do we do? Well, we get to wear really cool outfits. Look at that jacket, and we get to wear long leather gloves and a hat with a veil on it. We dress pretty snazzy. And not everybody does. Some people will go out without gloves and just in a t-shirt. Most beekeepers almost always will wear a hat or a hood that has a veil on it, because bees tend to get caught in your hair or want to crawl up your nose because they see a dark cavity and they're like, "Ooh, what's up there?" So it's just easier to keep them away from your face by always wearing headgear. The rest of it is kind of optional. It just depends on how you feel or how your bees are. Some bees can be very nice and gentle. Other bees can be a little more aggressive. Wearing a bee suit doesn't keep you from being stung, but it kind of avoids a lot of it. The worst part is because they crawl around on your arms and it tickles, and your first reaction is to brush them off. And then as soon as you do that, they're like, no, I don't think so. I wanted to sit there, leave me alone. And you start messing with them, and then they're going to sting you, or you're going to pinch them or something crazy. So it's kind of optional, but it's a good thing. And then our other main tool is a smoker, and we don't light them on fire. We're not heating anything up. It's just something that makes a distraction. We puff a little bit into the hive, and all of a sudden the bees are like, whoa, what's that? So then they don't notice us taking the roof off of their house or pulling it apart to look inside. Because remember, bees live in the dark, and as soon as you take the roof off, they're kind of like, whoa, turn off the lights. What are you doing? There's a draft. So it upsets them. So we kind of try to distract them a little bit by putting some smoke in there, and they start doing other things, thinking something else is going on besides that darn beekeeper is back to check on us. And then the other tool we use a lot is, it's just called a hive tool, and it's basic. It's a combination pry bar and scraper, because bees make wax, they glue everything down. So if you look into the box on that left-hand side picture, to get that frame out that Tim's holding, he had to take his pry bar and scraper and kind of work that frame loose, because they've glued it down. And as soon as you close them back up, they're busy back there repairing what we think we've cleaned up, because they didn't want it that way. And there's a lot of gadgets and bells and whistles out there for beekeepers, just like anything else you do. And you need some of them, you don't only need all of them. It just depends. Some people like to play with things or experiment. But this is the three main things you need for a beekeeper, besides bees in a hive, is just some kind of a head covering and or jacket, smoker tool, and hive tools. It's pretty easy to get started. So as a beekeeper, we can tell a lot just by watching the hive. I don't go into the hive except maybe every couple weeks. But I can still tell what's going on. I'll walk out and look at them. We've got chairs out by our hives, and we sit out there in the evening, and you can see them. One thing you want to see is a lot of bees. If you only have 10 bees, you kind of wonder that, well, where are the other, 50 whatever thousand bees? Why aren't they going in and out? And it's usually about half of the bees to a third will be the foragers that are going in and out. The rest of the bees are in the hive taking care of hive business. So it's not that you're going to see a cloud of 20,000 bees come pouring out of your hive. They leave in little groups here and there, here and there. Now it's kind of fun in the evening at certain times. It does look like rush hour on 270, because all of a sudden there are hundreds of bees coming back at one time, and they're waiting their turn to get in and landing on the front and walking around. And it's like, who's directing this traffic? What's going on? So you want to see a lot of bees going in and out, because then you've got a lot of foragers, they're getting a lot of food, there's a lot of bees inside to feed, so that's a good sign. And you'll see them bringing in pollen. Their little pollen baskets on their back legs will be full, and you'll see them coming in, and they kind of land with a little thunk because they're heavy with nectar, so that's good. Now if you happen to see a lot of them fighting, or 3 bees are ganging up on 1 bee, or they're tumbling around, or there's a bunch of aerial fights in front, that might be trouble. It could be some other bees are robbing, trying to steal the nectar and food inside from this hive. And it might be maybe this hive is kind of small for some reason. Maybe they can't defend it, and so they're having a lot of trouble. They're struggling, and there's a lot of fighting going on to protect that hive. So we can learn a lot just by watching the front, but we still go in every so often, and we'll check inside just to make sure things inside are going correctly. And so we'll pull frames and look at them. We want to make sure, they're building out the wax, they're getting enough, because without that comb, they don't have anywhere to store their food, and the queen has nowhere to lay eggs. So it's very important that if you need wax made, that you've got wax makers working on it. You want to make sure they get it all built out so they have enough. If they only have half of a frame, they don't have very much room for food or other bees. And because the workers have such a high turnover, you need to have a lot of eggs every day to hatch. to replace the ones that are the foragers that are dying. So we just go in and we look, and bees are really efficient because you would think, oh, they have a box of pollen, they have a box of honey, and then they have a box of eggs and brood. But they don't. They set up their nursery on each frame on each side. So the queen will lay her eggs in the middle section, and then they have a band of pollen and then a band of honey. And so everything they're going to feed to the young larva before it gets capped, they have right there. They don't have to run around to the next frame. They don't have to go up to the next box and bring it down. They store everything right there. It's kind of like their little nursery and their pantry right there all in one. Then as the bees are hatching out, they just backfill in with more pollen and more nectar and honey for the next group of eggs going in there. So they don't spend a lot of time running around getting supplies. They organize very well and keep things right there at hand. So another thing we want to do is make sure we give them enough room. Now, bees are always, they're crowded in. There's a lot of bees. They're used to crawling around, and that's okay. But they don't want to be too crowded because their goal is to actually build up a very big colony and then split in half. Because to a bee, they're creating another colony, and then therefore they're having a better chance at surviving because now there are two colonies, not one. So their thought is to build up. We need more bees. You know, they'll get to 80,000 or 100,000. Well, after a while, my boxes fill up, and they're like, okay, we're good. We've got a lot of bees. We can split up. Everybody will have enough to survive, and they'll swarm. And that's good for bees because they think they're doing a good thing because now there's two colonies of bees. But if you're a beekeeper, you see just the opposite. You're all of a sudden you're looking up in the tree and half your bees are gone. So unless you can catch that swarm back, you've lost half your bees and half of that workforce. So we kind of have to try to outguess the bees and manage them so that they don't think they're crowded. And if they are getting crowded, we can give them extra boxes for extra space. Maybe we can divide them ourselves before they get the idea and start splitting them up into half and put them in two boxes, which is okay because now I have two colonies, not half of my bees. But the other problem is you don't want to give them too much room. Bees are Goldilocks. They want it just right. They don't need a lot. They don't need too little. They like it just right. This was what happened my first year that I used a sugar tray in the winter. I put it in January, I think it was, or December. I put it in December when we had a warm day, and they got up to it in about January or February. And it was just a 2 or 3 inch tray. And I checked on them at the end of February, and they were eating. They were eating the sugar. It was fine. It'll tide them over till things warm up and start sprouting, and there's some nectar out there. Well, then it rained, and then it was cold, and I didn't get to them for a few weeks. And they had eaten through all that sugar, and all of a sudden they had this empty space between the last hive box and the cover of the hive. And when I went in to check on them finally, they decided it was empty space. They don't like empty space, so they filled it with wax. They started making all this comb. And at first I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I felt really bad because it's like, you can't have wax there because now when I take that sugar tray off, my lid's not going to fit. So I know how much it takes for them to build wax, and I kind of scraped it off and gently saved the wax and then tied it into empty frames so that they reattached it and just started building off of it and filled in. So it was a good thing. It was a bad thing. And then it turned out to be a good thing again. We saved their wax. They didn't have to lose a lot of wasted energy and material, but it's just something you have to watch. And it was my first year with a feeder. So now I know that when you got sugar trays on, check them, just peek in there every week because you never know how fast they go. And they built this wax out in just a few weeks. It was like kind of amazing. I didn't know they could go that fast. And then there's certain times of the year or conditions that we will feed them. We'll give them sugar water. Usually if you're starting a new hive, you want to give them some sugar water right there in the hive. They think it's nectar. And that helps stimulate their wax and supplement their wax making without having to actually lose workforce for foragers, because it's like, hey, we've got a whole bunch of sugar water here and we can use that for our wax. And sometimes in January, or not January, but in July to August, it gets pretty hot and dry around here. There isn't a lot going on. We don't want them to eat their honey stores. Remember, they're working on that May and June because they need that for the winter. So a lot of times we'll feed them just so that they have some extra and they don't have to wipe out their food supply. And then there's also things that we check for. They have pests, they have disease, just like anything else. But one of the big honeybee problems right now is called the varroa mite. And it would be similar to a tick that's on your dog or cat, except that these are on honeybees. They're small. It looks like you can see them, but they're really not that easy to see. We can do a couple of tests to get a reading on how many mites there are. If they're within a range, that's when we have to figure out a treatment that we're going to do. And there's various treatments. So we just kind of monitor again, because varroa can bring disease. It can weaken the bees. It'll make them sick. It can cause their wings to be deformed when when the larva develops. So varroas are bad. We're trying to get rid of them, and they're pretty tough. So we work on it and do what we can. A lot of bees will clean each other. So they do pull some of them off, but some are better than others about cleaning. So not everybody takes care of everybody else. And we kind of step in and do what we can, because varroa will wipe out a hive pretty fast. If they get in and take over, because the bees can't keep up with them, they will take over and end up killing the hive. And then hive beetles are also kind of a pest. They're always going to be in there. The best thing we can do is keep a nice, big, strong hive, because as long as the bees outnumber the beetles, they'll take care of them. They'll corner them and they'll trap them and get rid of them. There's always going to be some. We can't get rid of all of them. But the problem is if you have a weak hive, if you only have 20 or 30,000 bees, those beetles are probably going to get in and take over. And what they do, they get in and eat the pollen and the nectar, but they poop all over everything and they slime it all up. And then it's no good for anybody. They get in there and make a mess of the hive. The bees will leave because they're like, we're not dealing with this. And then the beetles leave because they're like, well, there's no more pollen coming in. There's no more bees here. And, they've trashed all the nectar and honey. So we try to keep that up. There's a few ways we can kind of help with beetles, but they're pretty tricky too. There's little gadgets and little traps and things. But basically, if we have a good, strong hive, the bees will take care of them. They won't let them outnumber. They'll run them off and flip them out the door or down to the bottom of the hive. Oops. Come on, there we go. And then one of the other things is the beekeeper that we want to keep track that they are on schedule with their honey storing. Because remember, they're planning ahead and they got to go to winter, and there's nothing in January that's going to help them. We can feed them, we give them sugar, but it's not as good. If they can have honey, there's much better food benefit in honey and food value than there is sugar. Sugar will do, it's kind of a temporary fix. So we want to make sure they're getting enough nectar, they're making enough honey. The hive that's in this picture, the winter picture, is my first hive, and I call them my main hive. They made 3 boxes of honey last year. They just went to town, but I didn't take all of it. And I wanted it because this was my first year of getting honey that I took from the hive. I've always left it for them. But they had 3 boxes. Well, I ended up leaving a box for them because that's what's going to get them through the winter. And then the other 2 boxes, I took 1 box and I split it with my other 2 hives because they were new hives. They were just getting started. And I thought, I'm going to give them a little bit of a boost, and I'll give them half a box of honey. And then that way they only have to work and fill in the other half. So I kind of split that between the 2 hives, which worked out because then everybody had a box of honey for winter and they all seemed to be doing well. I did take the 3rd box and I did extract that. So that was my first honey and I was pretty excited and that's a whole other process that you just can't imagine until you do it. And it's messy and it was hot and we had the best time. It was so much fun to see that pretty yellow honey in my jar. And then, so maybe by now you don't really want to be a beekeeper. It's not for everybody, but you're thinking, well, I'd still like to help bees or do something for them. And that's pretty easy. You don't even have to be a big gardener. You can plant a pollinator garden if you want, and that'll certainly help bees and the other pollinators. And if you don't have the space, just get a big flower pot and put it maybe on your deck or your driveway or somewhere sunny. Get a package of zinnias or cosmos. Those are just annuals. You sprinkle them in there, let them grow. Bees love both of those. And then in fall, they're going to die down and just pull them out and toss them. You don't have to do anything with them. But they're easy enough that they're handy in a big flower pot. And it'll give the bees something to eat. It'll be like a little snack station in your yard. And if you challenge your neighbors, say, hey, I'm putting this out for the bees. See if you can get them. Maybe your neighbor is a gardener and they want to do a big pollinator garden. Then that's great, because if you keep doing that down the street, just keep challenging each neighbor, all of a sudden your snack station turns into a really nice pollinator buffet. And they have a lot of variety of plants to choose from. And there's a lot of nectar available and pollen. But you just want to make sure that if you are planting plants, we want to use native plants. Those are just plants that are familiar around here. And we know that they're going to do well in our climate and our soil and our drought conditions. But it's also something the bees are familiar with. If we bring in something from California, it might be the most beautiful plant. But if a bee doesn't know it, they might investigate it, but they're probably going to go right past it because they don't know what it is. They're looking for something they're familiar with. But you can look on the plant tags. Some of the big box stores and even the garden centers, they have sections that are labeled either native plants or pollinators. And the growers are doing pretty well now with labeling things so you know that it's good for them. There are a lot of things out there that are actually kind of junk food. Excuse me. And they're pretty. I used to buy and plant impatiens like crazy because I loved all the colors they came in. Found out absolutely no food value at all. There's nothing in an impatient that anything gets from it. There's no pollen. There's, no nectar. They're pretty, but there's zero food value. So I was kind of like, oh, so I cut back on the impatiens. I still do some under one tree because at least they grow well, but then I concentrated on the regular plants just to make sure that all my pollinators, I don't even know, I'm not sure if it's my bees. Somebody told me that, you can plant right around your hive and they won't even notice it because they fly out and they go a distance and just go there. And it's like, oh, okay. But I'm pretty sure I like to think that I'm feeding my bees, or maybe somebody else's, but somebody's eating them. And then another thing that can help besides planting the food is if we can get rid of some of the chemicals. Now, it'd be great if we could say never use a chemical again, but that's not going to happen. And I'm a beekeeper and I use chemicals, but I only use them for certain things. And then the main thing is to just follow the label, use it as they instruct and how it's meant to be used. Don't spray ant spray if you're trying to get rid of a wasp. If you have a wasp nest, you probably don't need to spray the whole can on one little tiny nest. My neighbor was real good for that. Every year they'd build in the corner of his porch. He'd stand 12 feet away and aim that can, and he'd empty that whole can on this little wasp nest, and then it would be running down the porch post and dripping onto the driveway. And it's like, you just don't need to do that. You know, a little bit goes a long way, because now that residue is all over the place. It was drifting in the air. You know, just give it a squirt, let it do its job. So we need to just use them responsibly. If it's a weed, you might be able to dig it out instead of spraying it. You know, maybe if you have a lot of weeds, yeah, then you might have to use some kind of a fertilizer or a weed spray. So it happens. Excuse me. We can't do it totally without chemicals, but we just have to be sensible on how and when we use them. And if the only thing you do today is whatever we talked about, think of one thing that maybe you thought was really cool or interesting, and ask a family member or your friend or a neighbor, say, hey, did you know, bees fly two miles from the hive to find food? Or did you know they only live 4 to 6 weeks? And see what they say, because they may or may not know. And then they might say, oh, well, what else do you know? So the best thing we can do is get everybody in on it. Let them know what we know. Let them know why bees are important, why pollination is important, how much it all connects together, what we can do to help as far as planting things or not using chemicals. And one really important thing is to get kids involved with whatever you're doing, because they are the generation that is going to end up keeping the momentum going to solve a lot of these problems with helping bees, pollinators, pollution, any of the environmental threats we have. You know, I can do a lot, my kids can do a lot, but it's the next generation. They're going to be the ones, and they're going to have the ideas and the technology and everything to figure all this out. So we really need to get kids involved. And this is my neighbor, who, when I told her I was going to be a beekeeper, just about went running down the street because I said the word bee. And this is her 2 years ago with her nuke that she's starting her own beehive that she now has in my yard. So I've converted her over. Once you start talking bees, it's pretty easy to get people to kind of come over to your side and see things a little bit differently. Not everybody's going to be a beekeeper, but she's also a pretty good gardener too. So I hope that you think honeybees are pretty interesting. I think they're awesome. And I just keep learning more and more, and the way they function and organize and survive for a little tiny half-inch insect, I think is just amazing. So if you have any questions, if we don't get to anything, you can reach me, send me an email at education@3riversbeekeepers. Or if you have something general, or you need some more information about beekeeping or becoming a beekeeper, info@3Rivers goes to all of us on the board and the steering committee. And we just kind of take different topics that we're in charge of that people will respond to. And then maybe St. Peter's isn't all that convenient. There are a couple other clubs in the area. So, get on the website, check out Eastern Missouri or St. Louis Beekeepers or Jefferson County. St. Clair Beekeepers is just across the river in Illinois. And we actually have a handful of members that drive out to our club. They're members of 3 Rivers as well. So we all kind of interconnect. It's not a big competition thing. We're all doing Zoom meetings. Everybody's in under ours right now because it's just easier to combine forces with all this going on. So if we don't get to your question, feel free to check us out or look into more for beekeeping stuff. And now I'll stop talking.
Jill, thank you so much. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions for Jill about beekeeping or honeybees or bees in general, please feel free to use the chat box. We still have a few minutes left. Again, if you came in late or you had to step away for a minute, it is recorded, so it will be posted to the website later, just a matter of a couple of days or so. Three Rivers Beekeeping has a really handy dandy little informational sheet that if anyone is interested in, go ahead and send me an email directly at the library. I can mail it to you or I can send it out to you as an attachment. It's even available here to come pick up. We reopened, just in case nobody knew, the library's open. That's my big announcement for that. So yeah. Oh, exciting. Someone's getting ready to be a new beekeeper.
Yay!
Yeah. Keep us posted. Chris, if you have any questions, let her know.
Definitely, yeah. We just finished our beginners beekeeping class. We did it the end of January, actually, and I think it was 2 weekends, part January, part February. And I think Eastern Missouri has already had theirs, but get connected with the club, find out more. You can read a lot on the internet, but like anything, the disclaimers, don't read everything you believe. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody starts a blog or one of those chat things, and maybe they know what they're talking about, maybe they don't. And bees change all the time. You never know everything anyway, but connect with one of the clubs and find out a little bit, maybe try to get a mentor or somebody you can work with that you can go and see their hives and work with them, see if you're going to like it or not.
Now, Jill, do you also, so you keep honeybees, do you also have, because aren't there certain bees that are sort of solitary?
Yes. Yeah, mason bees are solitary bees. I do have one of those little kind of native bee houses that a friend of a friend makes some of those. And so he gave me one. I do have one of those. We had some little bees in there last year. My friend had one. It was actually a blue bee. And I thought he was crazy when he was telling me. And I went out to his house and he goes, "Come and see my blue bee." And it really is a blue bee. It's so cute.
All right then. And somebody just asked, what is the name of the handout that we can ask for? So it's the Three Rivers Beekeepers information sheet. I will happily send it to you.
And actually that might be posted on our website as well too, if they want to go and just look. It might be one of the pages about some of the things that we do.
Fantastic. All right. So someone's got a question. What are the bees' predators?
For honeybees, a lot of them are, mostly it's birds. There are dragonflies, which I couldn't even believe it. It's like, I love dragonflies and they're in my pond, but dragonflies will actually eat bees. If there are dead bees, sometimes skunks will eat them. I mean, they go into a hive and they're looking for bees because bees are a huge source of protein because of the food that they eat, which is the nectar and the pollen. So skunks and of course bears. We don't have any bears, thank goodness, to worry about. But they will eat bees. They'll go in and they'll try to scoop out bees from the bottom by the entrance or whatever, and they get stung eating them, but they keep eating for some reason. It's like they don't get affected by the sting like we do when we get stung. But
and then there's another question to go along with that. Where is a good place to locate a hive?
Anywhere. Mostly you want it to be in the sun, but maybe have a little bit of afternoon shade or protection from the really, really hot afternoon sun, but at least probably 60 to 70% sunny during the day, because that helps with a lot of hive pests because it gets very hot in there and they don't like it hot. They like it cool. So if you can get some sun exposure, it's good. It needs to be on level ground. You need to be within a water source. It could preferably not your neighbor's swimming pool. That usually causes trouble. But if you have a pond or even a bird bath, they have little things out on Pinterest making bee waterers with the pet waterers. You just put some rocks in the bottom of the bowl so that the bees can climb on them and not drown.
I've seen that with marbles too.
Yeah, marbles or little rocks, whatever. But there are a lot of cities that are promoting rooftop gardens and beehives now because a bee will fly 18 stories high. They don't mind, they'll be up there, they'll come down and find food, and they usually fly above the trees anyway, unless they're down, they're down in your yard on flowers. But when they take off to fly, they're usually flying pretty much above the tree lines. It's not like you see all these bees at eye level, they'd be bouncing off of us like crazy. So just about anywhere that has sun and it's dry, maybe protected from a north wind if you can, but you can only do so much to really protect them. But sun is the big issue. Sun and level, easy to get to because you want to be able, you don't want to put them way out in the middle of a pasture that you have to walk 3 miles to or something, because you want to be able to get out there and check on them, take care of them.
The Missouri Botanical Garden has a beehive that you can view from inside and out as well. So that's great news and fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Diana. Are there any other questions for anyone before we let Jill go on to her bees today? So they have a street light maybe 100 feet away from where we want to place a hive. Would this be a problem?
Don't think so. Maybe just try to point the entrance away from the light source. I mean, it'll still glow and give off light, but I don't think it'll cause too many problems. I think it'll remain dark enough that they'll know it's nighttime.
That's a good question.
Yeah, and you want to make sure you check, if you're going to do beehives, make sure you check with your city, township, your local codes. We're trying to build kind of a little bit of a reserve of information. And so as we find things out in certain areas and certain rules, some cities are very specific about if you can or cannot keep bees, and if you do, how you keep them, and distances and fencing and whatever. So just make sure you definitely check out your codes before you get a hive, just to make sure, because if you don't follow a code, your neighbors are going to let them know. And most places we found are pretty bee friendly, in the fact that they don't have anything that says you can't keep bees. It kind of falls under an agricultural or pest code of, if you have bees and they become a problem, if they're attacking people or they're a nuisance to somebody's pool, that kind of thing, then they have the right to come and tell you, you can't do this. But there aren't a lot of places that specifically say you cannot have bees. It just falls under a very general, well, if there's a problem, we're going to have to talk kind of a thing. And I know I just learned that Maryland Heights has, you can have bees, but they have certain requirements. It has to be within 6 feet of a property line. And if you need to keep 50 feet different distance from property lines, or else you have to have solid fencing around the line. And it's not that you're going to fence the bees in. What they're doing is just trying to protect other people from walking by and, being in a flight path or seeing and getting too curious. So when they say you have to have a fence to have bees, it's not because they're trying to keep the bees in your yard. That's not going to happen. It's just a barrier for public safety and to, any curiosity. So just check your codes, make sure. And if you don't know, if you can't find anything specific, just call your city hall and ask them. They're usually pretty good. They're used to us calling now and say, I have a question about beekeeping. And like, of course you do. But they might not have really even thought of it or had anybody call, so they don't have any specific rules. But keep them. And they usually, within the city, you're probably limited to 2, maybe 3 hives, depending. They usually go by the size of your yard so that it doesn't become a problem with that many bees flying around.
Are there any other questions before we sign off and say goodbye for the day? What is the size of a beehive?
Technically, usually there's a couple versions. The Langstroth type, which is what I use, it's a box and it has those wooden frames that you saw in the pictures, and they're kind of like hanging files. You just file your bees away in the box. Those boxes can come in a deep, a medium, or a shallow depth. Most of the times beekeepers will use the deep boxes for brood boxes, and those are about 9¼ inches, I think, roughly. The medium boxes are maybe 6½, or maybe it's 9½ and 6¼ and then the very little tiny shallow boxes used to be honey boxes, but they're almost so small that you don't get a lot of honey from them. A lot of people will use them if they're going to do comb honey instead of extracting, because when you cut the comb out of the smaller spaces, it doesn't take as much for the bees to rebuild that. And then you can do different depths. My boxes, I just use medium boxes because they're lighter. A deep box can weigh 90 pounds. And there is no way I could lift that and move it around and do things. And you can usually, on the width of the box, you can go 8 to 10 frames. So it's probably anywhere from 16 to 18 inches wide. If you're building equipment, there's tons of specs out there on the internet that you can find. You look at Beekeeping for Dummies, they've got pages out for all the different sizes, and if you're going to do 8 frames or 10 frames. I do 8-frame mediums just because they're a little bit lighter, but an 8-frame medium box of honey is still about 50 pounds, which is pretty much putting me at my limit, but it's worth it because it's honey. So it just kind of, it's a preference of what you want to do. That's why a lot of beekeepers will have 2 deep brood boxes and 1 medium honey box to get through. So what they'll do is the bees will backfill their brood frames, the middle box, and they'll backfill that with honey by fall, so that they start out in the bottom and they move up and they have that deep box of honey and they have a medium box of honey. That's usually enough to get them through, because my boxes are shallow, or the medium ones instead of deep. I always leave 3 medium on there, and they do the same thing. The top box is always solid honey, and then by fall they're starting to backfill that middle box, and they seem to do okay with it. It's just a matter of what you're comfortable working with, that they'll survive, they'll figure it out no matter what size you use. You just don't want to leave them in a little tiny box, because if they grow really big, remember, they're going to swarm and move out, and they think they've done a good thing, but you think they did a bad thing because now half your bees are gone.
Good stuff. Good question. All right, Jill, thank you. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for bringing Three Rivers Beekeepers presentation to the library. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Look for more beekeeping to coming toward the fall. I think we'll get Jill back again to talk about some basic beekeeping. I think that would be fun. And I will sign out now and say goodbye.
Thank you. Hopefully I'll hear from everybody. Email me if you have questions.
Fantastic.